In this video, we're counting down 15 real roads from around the world that were transformed into public spaces. These were once active streets and highways, but today they function as places for public gathering. Let's start with number 15, the Embarcadero Freeway removal, San Francisco. Embarcadero was once dominated by a double-deck elevated highway that carried State Route 480 along San Francisco's northeastern waterfront. Built in the late 1950s, the Embarcadero Freeway physically separated the city from San Francisco Bay. What is now a wide pedestrian-oriented boulevard with plazas, transit access, and public waterfront space, for decades was a loud, dark, vehicle-heavy road structure that limited access and visibility. The freeway was controversial almost from the moment it opened. Residents and urban planners criticized it for blocking views of the bay, depressing nearby property values, and creating a physical barrier between downtown and the waterfront. Despite opposition, it remained in use until 1989, when the Loma Prieta earthquake severely damaged it. Engineering assessments concluded that repairing the freeway would be expensive and complex. At that point, the city faced a clear choice: rebuild the road or remove it. After extensive public debate, San Francisco chose removal. Demolition began in 1991 and was completed by 1993. Importantly, the decision was not paired with the construction of a replacement highway. Instead, the corridor was redesigned as a surface boulevard integrated with public transit, pedestrian access, and civic space. The new Embarcadero Boulevard was planned with multiple functions. It carries vehicle traffic, but at lower speeds and volumes than the freeway once did. Wide sidewalks, landscaped medians, pedestrian crossings, and transit lanes were then added. The street now connects directly to public destinations like the ferry buildings, piers, plazas, and waterfront promenades that were previously cut off. The traffic that once relied on the freeway redistributed across the city's grid and regional routes. Studies conducted in the years following demolition showed that the predicted congestion disasters didn't materialize. Instead, travel patterns adjusted, with some trips shifting to transit and others disappearing altogether. The public space element of the Embarcadero is central to its current identity. Large areas that once sat beneath shadowed concrete decks are now open to the sky. The ferry building plaza became a focal gathering space, hosting markets and public events. The waterfront is fully accessible to pedestrians, cyclists, and transit riders, with uninterrupted movement along the bay. Economically, the corridor experienced significant redevelopment. Former industrial and underutilized parcels were converted into offices, housing, and public institutions. Property values rose, and the area became one of the city's most active zones. The Embarcadero's transformation is notable because it involved complete removal of major urban road structure rather than adaptation. The public space that replaced it is not symbolic or temporary, it's permanent and integrated into daily life. The corridor still functions as a street, but its design prioritizes people moving on foot and via transit rather than through traffic. This case is frequently cited in transportation and urban planning literature as evidence that removing road capacity doesn't automatically lead to gridlock. Instead, it shows how cities can reallocate space once devoted almost entirely to cars into environments that support civic life, economic activity, and waterfront access. Number 14. The Cheonggyecheon Corridor in Seoul, South Korea. Cheonggyecheon is one of the most documented examples in the world of a road transformed into a public space. For decades, this corridor in central Seoul was dominated by an elevated expressway carrying tens of thousands of vehicles a day. Beneath it ran a buried stream that had effectively disappeared from public life. Today, that same space is a 10-kilometer linear public park, pedestrian corridor, and restored waterway used daily by people and visitors. The transformation began in the early 2000s, after structural inspections revealed that the elevated highway, built in the 1960s, was deteriorating and increasingly expensive to maintain. Rather than rebuild the roadway, the Seoul metropolitan government made the decision to remove it entirely. Demolition began in 2003 and the expressway was fully dismantled by 2005. What replaced it was not a new road but a continuous public landscape designed for walking, gathering, and ecological restoration. Historically, it had been a natural stream that supported early settlements during the Joseon dynasty. As Seoul industrialized rapidly after the Korean War, the stream became heavily polluted and was eventually covered over to make way for road infrastructure. The elevated highway symbolized post-war modernization, but also contributed to noise and air pollution. Once the road was removed, engineers reconstructed the stream channel using a combination of groundwater pumping and diverted water from the Han River. This aspect of the project is often misunderstood. The restored stream is not fully natural, and it requires managed flow to remain viable. This is openly documented in the city, and it's part of an ongoing maintenance. The banks were reshaped to allow pedestrian access, bridges were rebuilt for cross streets, and multiple access points were added so people could move easily between the street level and stream corridor. The resulting space dramatically changed how the city center functions. Vehicle traffic didn't disappear, but redistributed across the surrounding streets and expanded public transit. Bus routes were reorganized, and Seoul invested heavily in bus rapid transit lanes to compensate for the loss of road capacity. Studies conducted after completion shows that average traffic speeds in the broader network remained stable, contradicting fears of permanent congestion. The Cheonggyecheon is now used for walking, commuting, cultural events, and informal recreation. Office workers eat lunch along the water, tourists move through the corridor on foot, and residents use it as a quiet alternative to nearby arterial roads. The space is fully open to the public and accessible at multiple points throughout the city. Environmental measures taken before and after the project show measurable changes. Surface temperatures in the corridor dropped relative to surrounding streets, partly due to the removal of asphalt and the introduction of vegetation. Air quality indicators did improve locally, though citywide changes were influenced by broader policies. Importantly, Cheonggyecheon was not a symbolic or cosmetic intervention. It permanently removed a major urban roadway and replaced it with a public space that fundamentally altered the land use, mobility patterns, and daily life in central Seoul. It shows that a space once dedicated almost entirely to vehicles can be reallocated to people, provided the change is paired with transportation restructuring and long-term management. It remains one of the clearest, most verifiable examples of a road corridor being transformed into a major public space. Number 13. Times Square Pedestrian Plazas. Times Square, it's now one of the most recognizable public spaces in the world, but for most of the 20th century, it functioned primarily as a vehicular roadway. Broadway and 7th Avenue intersected here in a complex, congested traffic pattern that prioritized cars over pedestrians, despite the area handling some of the highest foot traffic volumes in the United States. The transformation began in 2009 as a pilot project under the New York City's Department of Transportation. Portions of Broadway were closed to vehicle traffic between 42nd and 47th Streets, and temporary materials like paint, movable chairs, planters, and barriers were used to test whether the space could function as a pedestrian plaza. This wasn't a symbolic closure. It removed a functioning roadway from active use and repurposed it entirely for public access. Prior to the change, Times Square had a high rate of pedestrian injuries and chronic congestion. Vehicles moved slowly, but their presence limited usable space for people on foot. The pilot aimed to improve safety and circulation without reconstructing the entire street. Data collected during the pilot showed a sharp reduction in pedestrian injuries and an improvement in travel times along the adjacent avenues. Contrary to concerns, traffic didn't worsen citywide. Based on these results, the city made pedestrian plazas permanent. Construction of durable surfaces, seating, lighting, and drainage followed in the early 2010s. Today, the former roadway is a fully pedestrianized public plaza managed through a combination of city agencies and local business improvement districts. Cars no longer pass through this section of Broadway. Instead, the space supports walking, resting, performances, protests, and public gatherings. The iconic red steps and open seating areas sit directly on what was once active traffic lanes. Times Square's transformation is important because it occurred in one of the most traffic-intensive parts of the country. Unlike park projects built on vacant land, this change required removing an operational road and redefined its purpose. Emergency vehicle access was retained through design accommodations, but general traffic was permanently excluded. The redesign also shifted how people experience the area. Pedestrians no longer cluster tightly on narrow sidewalks, while cars dominate the center. Instead, people occupy the former roadbed, and buildings open visually onto a shared civic space. Commercial activity adapted quickly with storefronts and events oriented towards the plaza rather than passing vehicles, and maintenance and crowd management are ongoing challenges due to the sheer number of visitors, often hundreds of thousands per day, but these are operational issues rather than questions of viability. Times Square shows how a road can be transformed incrementally into a public space through testing, data collection, and redesign. It's not a theoretical model, but a fully realized long-term reallocation of street space in a dense global city. Number 12. Madrid Rio. Madrid Rio is a large linear public space created by transforming sections of Madrid's inner ring road, the M30, which once ran as a high-capacity urban highway, and for decades this road functioned as a physical barrier between central Madrid and its riverfront, prioritizing fast-moving traffic over public access. The M30 was one of the busiest roads in Spain, carrying heavy traffic directly through densely populated neighborhoods. Its proximity to residential areas generated noise, air pollution, and limited pedestrian movement. The Manzanares River itself became marginal to city life, largely inaccessible due to the road infrastructure that lined the banks. In the early 2000s, the city government initiated a major infrastructure project to address the issues. Rather than simply widening or upgrading the road, Madrid chose to bury significant sections of the M30 in tunnels. This allowed the surface land along the river to be reclaimed for public use. Construction began in 2004 and continued through to the late 2000s. Once traffic was redirected, the surface corridor was redesigned as Madrid Rio, a continuous public space stretching several kilometers along the river. Former roadways were replaced with pedestrian paths, cycling routes, playgrounds, sports facilities, and landscaped areas. Bridges were redesigned or rebuilt to improve pedestrian connectivity between neighborhoods. Madrid Rio is not a park built on vacant land. It occupies space that was previously devoted almost entirely to vehicle movement. And while the traffic still flows through corridor underground, the surface environment functions as a public realm rather than a transportation corridor. And that distinction is important. The road wasn't merely narrowed or beautified, it was fundamentally transformed in how people experience and use the space. The project significantly changed mobility patterns. By removing the surface traffic, pedestrian access between neighborhoods improved and the riverfront became part of daily routines for walking, recreation, and commuting. The public space is used year-round by residents rather than primarily by tourists. Environmental monitoring following the project did document improvements in local air quality and noise levels along the corridor. Green space coverage increased substantially, and the river itself underwent ecological restoration, with improved flow conditions and habitat enhancements. Madrid Rio also altered how the city relates to its infrastructure. The project demonstrated that even high-capacity urban roads can be rethought when long-term public benefit is prioritized. While the construction was expensive and complex, it didn't eliminate traffic capacity. Instead, it relocated it in a way that freed surface space for public use. Today, Madrid Rio is one of the most widely used public spaces in the city. It connects cultural institutions and historic areas along a continuous corridor that was once dominated by traffic noise and exhaust. The transformation is permanent and deeply embedded in Madrid's urban fabric. Madrid Rio stands as a clear, verifiable example of a road being transformed into public space, not by symbolic gestures but through structural change. It shows how cities can reclaim infrastructure corridors and convert them into a shared civic environment while maintaining essential transportation functions elsewhere. Number 11. Strøget Pedestrian Street, Copenhagen, Denmark. Strøget is one of the earliest and most influential examples of a road permanently transformed into a public space. Located in central Copenhagen, this is a 1.1-kilometer corridor made up of several connected streets that were once used primarily by vehicles. Since the early 1960s, it's functioned as a fully pedestrianized public street and has become a reference point for cities around the world considering similar transformations. Before its conversion, it operated as a conventional urban street carrying cars, delivery vehicles, and trams through Copenhagen's historic core. By the mid-20th century, rising traffic volumes were creating congestion and safety concerns, while the narrow medieval street layout limited sidewalk space. Pedestrians were increasingly pushed to the margins despite the area being one of the city's busiest commercial zones. In 1962, the Copenhagen City Council approved a trial closure of the street to vehicular traffic. This decision was controversial at the time. Denmark, like many countries, was experiencing rapid growth in car ownership, and there was concern that removing vehicles would harm retail activity and disrupt access. The initial closure was implemented as an experiment, using minimal physical changes rather than permanent reconstruction. The results were closely observed. Pedestrian activity increased immediately. Cafe seating expanded into the former roadway, and retail sales didn't decline as predicted. Instead, foot traffic increased and businesses adapted to a street environment designed for walking rather than driving. Based on the outcomes, the city made the pedestrianization permanent and gradually extended it to adjoining areas. Over time, it evolved into a continuous public space rather than a single street. The former road surface was repaved to support walking and informal gathering. Street furniture, lighting, and seating were added, but the design remained relatively restrained. Vehicle access was restricted to emergency and limited service use during designated hours. This area has transformed and influenced how Copenhagen approached public space more broadly. Rather than treating streets solely as traffic corridors, the city began measuring how people used outdoor space, how long they stayed, where they gathered, how different designs affected social activities. This approach later informed Copenhagen's extensive network of pedestrian streets and bicycle infrastructure. Today, it's a major civic space, commercial street, and a tourist destination. It supports daily commuting on foot, informal social interaction, street performances, and demonstrations. The space is publicly accessible at all times and is actively maintained by the city. And importantly, it's not a case of a street being widened or beautified while remaining a road. It represents a complete change in function, where a vehicle corridor was permanently reassigned to pedestrians. The traffic didn't simply disappear, it was redirected to surrounding streets. Its success has been extensively documented in urban planning research, particularly through studies by Danish architect Jan Gehl and others who analyzed changes in public life following pedestrianization. These studies provided verifiable evidence that converting a road into public space can increase street life without undermining the economic activity. It remains one of the clearest examples of a road transformed into public space through deliberate policy, careful observation, and gradual refinement. More than 60 years after the cars were removed, it continues to function as a central artery of public life in Copenhagen. Number 10. Seoullo 7017 Sky Garden, Seoul, South Korea. Seoullo 7017 is a public pedestrian park created from a former vehicular overpass in central Seoul. Originally, it was built in 1970 as part of the city's road network. The structure once carried cars above major rail lines near Seoul Station. Today, it functions as a linear public space connecting neighborhoods that were once previously divided by infrastructure. By the early 2000s, structural assessments found that the overpass was aging and no longer suitable for traffic without extensive reinforcement. Rather than demolish it outright or build it for cars, the Seoul metropolitan government chose to repurpose the structure as a pedestrian corridor. The project was completed in 2017, which is reflected in the name 7017, referencing the year of construction and the year of transformation. It's approximately 1 kilometer long and elevated several meters above street level. The former roadway surface was reinforced and redesigned to support foot traffic, seating, and landscaping, and vehicle lanes were removed entirely, and access points like stairs, ramps, and elevators were added to connect surrounding streets. The transformation changed how the space functions within the city. What was once a piece of infrastructure designed solely to move vehicles quickly through the area is now a place for walking, resting, and moving between neighborhoods on foot. The design incorporates hundreds of plants arranged in circular planters, which also serve as seating and wayfinding elements. While often described as a park, it is fundamentally a repurposed road, not a landscaped area built on vacant land. The structure, alignment, and connections all reflect its origins as a traffic overpass. From a mobility perspective, the closure of the road required traffic redistribution. Vehicle capacity was removed rather than replaced, and surrounding streets absorbed the changes through signal adjustments and routing changes. And that process was documented by city authorities and monitored following the opening of the Sky Garden. Seoullo 7017 plays a role in economic and social connectivity. By linking Seoul Station with nearby commercial districts and markets, it improved pedestrian access to local businesses. Small shops and street-level activity increased in some adjacent areas following the project, though impacts did vary by location. This space is publicly accessible and free to use, with lighting and security measures allowing for evening access. Maintenance is handled by the city, including structural inspections, plant care and cleaning, and emergency access is provided through designated routes and service points. It's often compared to rail-to-park projects, but its origin as a road carrying cars makes it distinct. It represents a direct reassignment of a vehicle's structure into public space. As with Cheonggyecheon, Seoullo 7017 illustrates Seoul's broader shift away from car-dominated infrastructure in certain areas. It shows how a public road can be transformed, not only at ground level, but also in elevated form, into a space centered on public use. It demonstrates a very different but fully real approach to converting a road into a public space, one through grounded-level pedestrianization and another through elevated structural reuse, grounded in documented long-term urban change rather than temporary or symbolic interventions. Number 9. La Rambla, Barcelona, Spain. La Rambla is one of Europe's most recognizable public promenades, but for much of its modern history it functioned primarily as a traffic-carrying road rather than a pedestrian space. Today, La Rambla is a central public corridor that's dominated by walking, social activity, and street life, representing a long-term transformation of a roadway into a civic space. Its origins trace back to a seasonal stream bed that ran just outside Barcelona's medieval walls. As the city expanded in the early modern period, this corridor was urbanized into a broad street. By the 19th and early 20th centuries, it had become a conventional urban road, carrying horse-drawn vehicles, trams, and later automobiles. As Barcelona grew denser, its role evolved. Its central location made it a natural gathering place. Pedestrian volume steadily increased, especially as cafes, theaters, and markets concentrated along the corridor. By the mid-20th century, foot traffic frequently overwhelmed the sidewalks, while vehicle movement slowed down due to congestion. So rather than expanding the road capacity, the city gradually reallocated the space. Traffic lanes were reduced, sidewalks widened, and the central median was formalized as a continuous pedestrian promenade. Over time, the median became the primary space of activity, while vehicle traffic was relegated to narrow side lanes. By the late 20th century, La Rambla had effectively ceased to function as a through road in the traditional sense. Cars still did have limited access, but the design, the signaling, and spatial emphasis clearly favored pedestrians. Its transformation is important because it shows how a road can become a public space without being completely erased. The corridor still accommodates service vehicles, local access, and emergency use, but those functions are secondary. The primary purpose of the space is public movement, gathering, and commerce. Urban life along La Rambla reflects this shift. The promenade supports daily walking, tourism, informal social interactions, protests, and festivals. Nearby neighborhoods use it as a connector rather than an obstacle, and the adjacent La Boquera market, for example, relies heavily on pedestrian access rather than vehicle throughput. The city has continued to refine La Rambla's role as a public space. In recent years, Barcelona has launched formal redesign initiatives aimed at further reducing vehicle presence, and those plans build on decades of documented change rather than introducing a new concept. What was once a road dominated by traffic has become a public corridor where walking and civic life take priority. Its success is in gradual, verifiable change rather than sudden or symbolic intervention. It's a long-established example of how cities can repurpose major streets into public spaces through incremental redesign, policy shifts, and sustained pedestrian demand. It shows that roads don't have to disappear entirely to become places for people. Number 8. Calle Madero, Mexico City. Calle Madero. It's a historic street in Mexico City's Centro Histórico, which was fully transformed from a vehicle road into a pedestrian public space in the early 21st century. Today, it's one of the busiest pedestrian streets in Latin America, but for centuries it functioned as a conventional urban roadway carrying carts, trams, and later automobiles through the heart of the capital. Linking Zocalo with western parts of the historic center, its location placed it at the core of political, religious, and commercial life. As Mexico City modernized, the street became increasingly congested. Narrow sidewalks struggled to accommodate growing pedestrian volumes. By the early 2000s, Calle Madero had become a safety concern. Pedestrian injuries were frequent, air quality was poor, and the street's historic buildings were exposed to constant vibration and pollution. Despite this, though, it remained an active traffic route due to its centrality. In 2010, the Mexico government made the decision to close it entirely to private vehicles. This wasn't a temporary experiment. The street was permanently pedestrianized, with the former roadway repaved for walking and street-level activity. Vehicle access was limited to emergency services and tightly controlled deliveries during restricted hours. Pedestrian volumes increased dramatically, and travel through the historic center became safer and more efficient for people on foot. Unlike streets that remained visually similar after pedestrianization, Calle Madero underwent a clear shift. The entire width of the former road became public space. People walked freely across what once were traffic lanes, and buildings opened directly onto a shared environment. Importantly, traffic didn't disappear, it was rerouted to the surrounding streets. The city adjusted signal timing and circulation patterns to accommodate the changes. Studies conducted after the pedestrianization found that overall mobility in the center improved rather than deteriorated, and walking became the fastest way to move through the area. It now supports a wide range of public uses. It functions as a commuter route, a tourist corridor, informal gathering space, and a venue for public events. Street performers, vendors, and cultural activities occupy the space throughout the day, and the street is accessible at all times. Its transformation is a clear example of a road fully relinquishing its vehicle function to become a public space. It wasn't built as a plaza and didn't emerge from vacant land. It was a functioning road that was deliberately reassigned to pedestrians based on safety data and mobility needs. Together, La Rambla and Calle Madero show two different paths to the same outcome. One evolved gradually over the decades, the other shaped through decisive policy shift. Both are real, verifiable cases of roads becoming public spaces that now shape daily life in their cities. Moving on to number 7, Right-Back-Seine Expressway in Paris. The Voie Georges Pompidou was once a high-speed urban expressway running along the right bank of the Seine, carrying tens of thousands of vehicles daily through central Paris. For decades, this riverside road was prioritized through traffic over public access to the river. Today, large sections of that former roadway function as permanent public promenades, marking one of the most consequential road-to-public space transformations in Europe. The expressway was built in the 1960s as part of a broader push to modernize Paris for automobile travel. Running directly along the river at a lower elevation than surrounding streets, it formed a physical barrier between the city and the Seine. Pedestrian access to the riverbank was limited, noisy, and often unsafe. While roads improved vehicle flow for commuters, it degraded the river's role as a civic space. By the early 2000s, air quality concerns, noise impacts, and changing priorities prompted renewed debate over the road's future. Temporary summer closures demonstrated that the roadway could function as a pedestrian space without paralyzing the city. The closures were closely monitored and provided real data on traffic redistribution and public use. In 2016, the city of Paris permanently closed a central stretch of the expressway to cars. The decision followed years of study, public consultation, and environmental review. The transformation changed how Parisians interacted with the river. For the first time in decades, residents could walk uninterrupted along the Seine at water level, without traffic noise or exhaust. The space is now used for commuting on foot or by bicycle, leisure walking, cultural programming, and seasonal events. It's fully public, open year-round, and integrated into the city's pedestrian network. The traffic impacts were real but manageable. Some vehicle trips shifted to parallel routes or disappeared altogether as people adjusted. Studies published by the city showed that congestion didn't increase citywide in the long term, and public transit use and walking increased in the central areas. The Right Bank project is important because it didn't replace the expressway with a park built elsewhere. The road itself became the public space. The asphalt, alignment, and river edge geometry are still visible, and it made the transformation legible and verifiable. It is a permanent reassignment of urban priority from cars to people. Number 6. Paseo del Bayo, surface corridor in Buenos Aires. The Paseo del Bayo is a large infrastructure project in Buenos Aires that removed surface road dominance and converted former traffic space into a public realm, while relocating heavy vehicle traffic underground. The corridor runs between the city center and the port area, historically one of the most congested parts of the city. Before the project, trucks serving the port shared surface streets with buses, taxis, and pedestrians. That created constant congestion, high accident rates, and limited public access. The streets functioned primarily as a freight corridor rather than an urban space. Construction began in 2017 and was completed in 2019. The core intervention involved placing freight traffic into a dedicated below-grade roadway. This allowed the surface streets, previously dominated by trucks, to be redesigned for public use. Lanes were removed, sidewalks widened, and new green spaces added. The surface environment now prioritizes walking, cycling, and local access rather than through traffic. While some vehicle lanes remain for buses and local circulation, the space no longer functions as a road designed around heavy transport. Instead, it operates as a linear public space. This transformation improved safety. Traffic collisions involving pedestrians decreased and air quality along the corridor improved. Paseo del Bayo is important because it shows a real structural road transformation, not a cosmetic street calming. A core transportation function was relocated, allowing the surface to be reclaimed for public life. This public use of the corridor includes walking, cycling, resting, and neighborhood movement rather than vehicle throughput. New crossings link downtown Buenos Aires with the riverfront and restores access to that had been blocked for decades. The project integrates trees, lighting, seating, and drainage, all designed for long-term use. Together, the Paris Right Bank and the Paseo del Bayo show two different but fully verifiable methods of road transformation. One removes vehicles entirely at surface level, the other relocates them to allow public life to reclaim the street. Both demonstrate that roads can become public spaces through structural change, grounded in real transportation planning rather than symbolism. Number 5. Gwanghwamun Square, Seoul. Gwanghwamun Square occupies what was once one of the most vehicle-dominated roads in South Korea. For decades, this corridor in front of the palace functioned as a multi-lane arterial road designed to move traffic quickly through central Seoul. Today, it's a linear civic square and a public gathering space, and it represents a documented transformation of roadway infrastructure into pedestrian-oriented environments. Historically, the area in front of the Gwanghwamun Gate held ceremonial and civic importance dating back to the Joseon dynasty. That role diminished in the 20th century as Seoul rapidly modernized. By the post-war period, the space had been widened into a broad road carrying heavy traffic, severing the visual and physical connection between the palace and the surrounding city. Pedestrians were confined to narrow sidewalks, and the historic axis of the area was largely obscured by cars and buses. Initial efforts to reclaim the space began in the early 2000s. In 2009, the city introduced a central median plaza by removing some traffic lanes and installing pedestrian space between the opposing flows of traffic. While this was an improvement, the road still functioned primarily as a vehicular corridor. A more substantial transformation happened in the late 2010s and early 2020s. After extensive studies, public consultation, and traffic modeling, Seoul undertook a major redesign that further reduced vehicle lanes and expanded the public realm. The redesigned square opened in 2022 as a largely car-free civic space with wide pedestrian areas, landscaping, and open ground connecting directly to historic landmarks. The public space exists directly on the former road alignment. Traffic that once occupied the center of the corridor was removed or rerouted to surrounding streets. Buses and general traffic were reorganized into fewer lanes, placed away from the main public space. The square now supports walking, public events, demonstrations, and daily civic use, and it's become a focal point for national gatherings and protests. People move freely across areas that were once traffic lanes, and sight lines to the palace have been reopened. From a transportation perspective, the project required substantial coordination. Traffic volumes were redistributed rather than eliminated, and public transit was prioritized along parallel corridors. The city documented the changes and monitored congestion levels following the redesign, and while adjustments were necessary, the corridor no longer functions as a through road in the way it once did. The space wasn't beautified while remaining a road, its fundamental purpose changed. Vehicles became secondary, and people became the primary users. Gwanghwamun Square is a clear, verifiable example of a road being transformed into a public space through staged intervention and long-term planning. It shows how historical, political, and urban priorities will converge to reassign space once dominated by cars to civic use. Number 4. Market Street, San Francisco. Market Street has long been San Francisco's primary transportation spine, but its central sections have undergone a documented transformation from a multi-lane traffic road into a people-first public corridor. While Market Street still carries transit, its role as a general-purpose car route has been largely eliminated. For much of the 20th century, Market Street carried private vehicles, buses, streetcars, and freight traffic. The width and alignment made it an attractive route for cars moving across downtown, but this also led to congestion, frequent collisions, and conflicts between vehicles, cyclists, and pedestrians. In the 2010s, San Francisco began implementing a phased strategy to reduce private vehicle access on Market Street. By 2020, most private cars were prohibited from large sections of the corridor. The street wasn't closed entirely, instead it was reprogrammed. Transit vehicles, bicycles, and pedestrians became the primary users, while private car traffic was removed. This change was formalized through policy rather than temporary closures. Enforcement, street design changes, and signal adjustments made the car restrictions permanent. The former traffic lanes didn't simply sit empty, they became flexible public spaces used for walking, cycling, and street-level activity. The whole character of the street shifted from a road people crossed quickly to a corridor people occupied. It's not a park and not a plaza in the traditional sense, but it functions as a linear public space where vehicles no longer dominate. Pedestrian injury rates have declined after car restrictions, and transit reliability improved due to the reduced interference from private vehicles. The change also affected how adjacent buildings and spaces interacted with the street. Storefronts and entrances now open onto a calmer environment, and people spend more time along the corridor rather than avoiding it. The street supports daily commuting, demonstrations, informal gatherings, and public life without being shaped around cars. More importantly, Market Street's redesign didn't require burying traffic underground or removing the street. The transformation happened through a policy-driven reassignment of the space, supported by physical design changes and enforcement. Market Street shows that a road can become a public space even while remaining an active transit corridor. By removing private cars, the city changed the balance of power in the street. What was once a multi-lane vehicular road now operates as a shared civic corridor centered on movement by people rather than vehicles. Together, Gwanghwamun Square and Market Street show that two complementary approaches to road transformation. One converts a ceremonial arterial into a civic square. The other reprograms a central commercial street into a car-free public corridor. Both are real, permanent, and verifiable examples of roads becoming public spaces through deliberate urban policy. Number 3. Hudson River Park, West Side Highway removal, New York City. Hudson River Park, it occupies land that was once dominated by the West Side Highway, a multi-lane elevated surface roadway that carried heavy traffic along Manhattan's western edge. For much of the 20th century, this corridor functioned primarily as a vehicle route, cutting neighborhoods off from the Hudson River. Today, large portions of that former road operate as a continuous public waterfront park. The original West Side Highway opened in stages, beginning in the 1930s as an elevated structure designed to move trucks and cars efficiently along Manhattan. Over time, the highway deteriorated, and in 1973 a section collapsed under a truck, leading to a partial closure because of safety concerns. Rather than rebuild the highway in its original form, New York City and New York State entered a prolonged debate over its future. By the 1980s, it became clear that rebuilding the elevated road would be costly and politically contentious. The traffic volumes had already adjusted as drivers rerouted to other corridors, and this created an opportunity to rethink how the waterfront corridor could function. The transformation was not instantaneous. Portions of the road remained in use for years while funding, jurisdiction, and land ownership was resolved. Eventually, the corridor was redeveloped as Hudson River Park, a linear public space extending several miles along the river. While the surface road still exists there, the river-facing portion, once occupied by highway, became public space rather than a transportation facility. Hudson River Park sits directly on a former road and port infrastructure. Piers that once supported freight activity and vehicle access were rebuilt as recreational spaces. The park includes walking and cycling paths, lawns, sports facilities, and boat access. The key transformation here is functional. What had been a corridor for through traffic became a destination. People now slowly moved, linger, and interacted in a space once defined by speed and noise. Traffic impact was carefully studied during the transition, and while some congestion shifted to other routes, the anticipated gridlock from highway removal didn't. This outcome has been documented in transportation research examining the effects of road removal in these kind of urban environments. But Hudson River Park shows that even major urban highways can be partially removed and replaced with public space without collapsing citywide mobility. The corridor remains legible as infrastructure, but its purpose has fundamentally changed. It's no longer a road people rush through, it's a public place people go to. Number 2. The city center pedestrianization in Pontevedra, Spain. Pontevedra is a small city in northwestern Spain that carried out one of the most comprehensive road-to-public space transformations in Europe. Beginning in the late 90s, it systematically removed private vehicle traffic from most of its historic center, converting the streets that once functioned as ordinary roads into public spaces. Before the transformation, its city center looked much like other Spanish cities of its size. Narrow streets carried cars, parking occupied public space, and pedestrians navigated around the vehicles despite high foot traffic. Accidents involving pedestrians were common, and noise levels were high relative to the scale of the city. In 1999, the municipal government adopted a clear policy shift. The city center would prioritize people over cars. This wasn't a temporary experiment or a single street closure. Over time, most roads within the central area were closed to through traffic. Parking was removed, speed limits were reduced to a walking pace where vehicles remained, and the street network was redefined as public space. Streets were repaved to remove visual cues that encouraged driving, like lane markings and curbs. The entire width of the former roads became shared pedestrian space. Vehicle access was limited to deliveries, residents, and emergency services. Importantly, it didn't build bypass highways or underground tunnels to replace the removed road. Instead, traffic was redirected to the perimeter routes, and over time, driving through the core simply stopped being the fastest or easiest option. Pedestrian injuries declined sharply, and fatalities in the city center dropped to zero for extended periods. Public life increased as streets became places for children to play, people to socialize, and business to extend outdoor activity into the public realm. While the buildings remain the same, the experience of moving through the city has changed completely. Former traffic corridors now have daily routines, markets, and events. The transformation is significant because it shows that road-to-public space conversion isn't limited to megacities or iconic projects. Pontevedra demonstrates how an entire network of ordinary streets can be reassigned to public use. Together, Hudson River Park and Pontevedra illustrate two ends of the scale. One repurposes a major urban highway into a waterfront public space. The other converts everyday streets into car-free civic environments. Both are real, permanent transformations where roads ceased to function primarily as corridors for vehicles and became public spaces integrated into people's daily lives. Number 1. The Broadway pedestrianization in New York City. Broadway is one of the clearest examples of a working urban road being deliberately transformed into a public space at scale. And its most consequential section extends beyond Times Square through Union Square, Herald Square, and the Flatiron District. While Broadway is often associated with theaters, for most of its history it functioned as a conventional arterial road carrying private vehicles. The transformation of large sections of this corridor into pedestrian-dominant public space is a permanent change in how the streets function. Before pedestrianization, Broadway cut diagonally across Manhattan's grid, intersecting with north-south avenues at irregular angles. This kind of geometry created complex intersections, slow-moving traffic, and frequent conflicts between cars and people. In areas like Union Square and Madison Square, pedestrian volumes were very high, yet most of the street space was allocated to vehicles that moved slowly or sat in congestion. The city's intervention didn't begin as a symbolic gesture. In 2009, New York City's Department of Transportation initiated a pilot project that closed segments of Broadway to private vehicles south of Times Square, including areas around Union Square and the Flatiron Building. These closures removed active traffic lanes and reallocated them to pedestrians. The results were closely measured. Traffic flow on adjacent avenues improved rather than worsened as vehicles shifted to a more direct north-south route. Pedestrian injuries declined, travel times for buses improved, and foot traffic increased in the newly reclaimed space. Based on this data, the city made the changes permanent and then expanded them. Union Square and Herald Square illustrate the impact clearly. Where cars once queued at intersections, people now sit, gather, and eat, move freely across wide-open space. They also host seasonal markets and public programming here, reinforcing their role as a civic space rather than traffic infrastructure. Broadway's pedestrianization didn't eliminate the transportation function entirely, though. Buses, cyclists, and service vehicles continue to use the surrounding streets, and subway access remains integrated into the plazas. Emergency access is maintained through design accommodations, however, the priority of the space is unambiguous. People on foot come first. Economically, the transformation reinforced the value of public space. Retail and commercial activity along the sections remained strong and in some cases increased as the foot traffic became more consistent. Businesses adapted by orienting entrances and seating towards the plazas rather than the curb. The iconic Flatiron building now anchors a public space rather than a chaotic traffic junction, altering how the area is experienced without changing the buildings themselves. What makes Broadway the strongest example on this list, though, is its size, its permanence, and its replication. This wasn't a single plaza or an isolated block. It was a coordinated reprogramming of a major road across multiple neighborhoods. The road didn't just simply calm traffic or add decoration. It ceased to function as a through road entirely in key sections. Today, the pedestrianized portions of Broadway are fully embedded in New York's public life. They are used daily, maintained by the city, and treated as permanent civic infrastructure. Broadway's conversion stands as the definitive example of how a road once built for vehicles can become a public place, shaped by people, without speculation, without symbolism, and without reversal.